What's up, guys? Derek, moreplates.moredates.com. Today we're going to be talking about S4, also known as Andarine. This is going to be the most comprehensive YouTube video and post on the entire internet about S4. I promise you that, so stick around if you want to hear everything from preclinical data, efficacy, side effects, what you can expect, how it works at the androgen receptor level, pharmacodynamics, pharmacokinetics, etc. Let's get into it. So S4, also known as Andarine, is an abandoned selective androgen receptor modulator, SARM, that was intended mainly for the treatment of benign prostatic hypertrophy. So this is not to be confused with S40503, because everyone sees the S-4 and they think it's the same thing. It's definitely not. S4 is a SARM originally developed by GTx Inc. with the intention of treating a variety of degenerative musculoskeletal diseases and benign prostatic hypertrophy. It was also being evaluated for its potential therapeutic applications in males and females for modulation of fertility, erythropoiesis, osteoporosis, sexual libido, and in men with or at high risk of prostate cancer. It's orally bioavailable, no injections needed, non-steroidal, and has tissue-selective anabolic effects in muscle and bone while sparing other androgenic effects that come from anabolic androgenic steroids. Now, when I say sparing, I mean relative. That's not necessarily absent of those effects. Testosterone and DHT are the main endogenous androgens produced in the body that fulfill basic physiological functions in men. These are essential for male development, as well as the maintenance of male secondary characteristics. The ability to build muscle and maintain bone mineral density, among several other key processes, are facilitated via these hormones, but they are inherently flawed by their lack of tissue selectivity. DHT is several-fold more androgenic than testosterone, and even in the absence of DHT, if 5-alpha reduction is manually inhibited with a drug like finasteride or dutasteride, testosterone itself only exhibits a 2-to-1 selectivity for muscle to prostate. The effects of these two androgens are transcribed and executed predominantly through the androgen receptor. While they fulfill necessary physiological functions in the body, their very presence often induces a variety of negative health consequences due to their androgenicity. Just some of these include a dose-dependent increased risk of prostatic hypertrophy, unhealthy serum lipids, and cardiovascular disease. The scope of anabolic androgenic steroid use in a clinical setting to treat degenerative musculoskeletal diseases is extremely limited too, as their androgenicity disqualifies them from being viable treatment options for women entirely and men in many cases too. Consequently, the need in modern medicine for anabolic agents that exhibit a complete selectivity for muscle and bone with a lack of stimulation in the prostate and other negatively affected androgen sensitive tissues was and still is very high. In general, SARMs exhibit much greater androgen receptor selectivity, oral bioavailability, and overall tissue selectivity than steroids. At a time, S4 was one of the lead candidates in the scope of promising SARMs, being described as the ideal SARM due to once per day dosing, high level of bioavailability, and the significant amount of preclinical data exhibiting a desirable level of anabolic effects in muscle and bone relative to androgenic activity. It is less potent in both anabolic and androgenic effects than other SARMs that were developed like Estrogen and LGD-4033. Andarine was eventually abandoned and didn't undergo any published phase 1 human clinical trials. We can only guess why this was, but it was more likely than not its lack of potency relative to GTX's current lead candidate, which is Estrogen. Even if Andarine went on to human trials, it almost undoubtedly would have been discontinued anyways due to the night vision side effect that likely disqualifies it as a viable treatment option. Mechanism of action. S4 acts as a full androgen receptor agonist in muscle tissue and a partial agonist in the prostate. The in vitro activity of S4 demonstrated high androgen receptor binding affinity with a Ki equal to 7.5 nm. It is rapidly absorbed following oral dosing and peaks in the bloodstream between 48 to 84 minutes. It exerts tissue-specific anabolic effects in vivo with a favorable selectivity for muscle and bone to prostate and seminal vesicles. After binding to the androgen receptor, S4 exerts tissue-specific anabolic effects in vivo in a dose-dependent manner by inhibiting bone turnover, stimulating bone formation, and building muscle mass while stimulating prostate and seminal vesicles to a much lesser extent. S4 effects increases muscle mass with high selectivity. S4 versus testosterone propionate study. So the anabolic activity of S4 is much more selective than testosterone and is accomplished with a relatively minor effect on prostate size and other androgen affected tissues like hair follicles. So treatment of castrated rats with S4, also known as GTx-007, showed greater anabolic activity than rats treated with testosterone propionate. The levator anti-muscle maintained the same weight as intact control rats and was greater than the same dose of testosterone achieved. What this demonstrates is that milligram for milligram Andarine or S4 is more potent than testosterone when it comes to building muscle at the dosages tested, and it was able to prevent muscle wasting with greater efficacy than testosterone with far less prostate stimulation. When an animal is castrated, its endogenous androgen levels plummet because it is no longer capable of producing them through the main mechanism by which the body facilitates it. Consequently, prostate weight, seminal vesicle weight, and muscle weight all plummet in parallel to the crashing androgen levels, hence why low testosterone in men causes loss of muscle tissue. This allows scientists to administer exogenous androgens and SARMs to evaluate how potently and selectively they transcribe their anabolic effects in the animal body, as the ideal SARM with optimal selectivity would restore muscle weight to that of a healthy intact control animal with normal endogenous androgen production, but prostate weight would not be stimulated whatsoever and would remain the weight of castrated control rats. S4 doesn't accomplish this, but it's one of the closest SARMs to accomplishing it. This was one of the first experiments ever conducted in vivo that demonstrated the efficacy and selective nature of SARMs. In this study, S4 selectively promoted prostate weight to 33.8% and levator anti-muscle weight to 101% of intact control, while testosterone propionate non-selectively increased prostate weight to 121% and levator anti-muscle weight to 104% of intact control. At the time, S4 was the most efficacious SARM in development and revealed some of the most promising preclinical data of a SARM, demonstrating potent anabolic effects with less androgenic activity than naturally produced endogenous androgens. S4 versus DHT study. In another study where S4 is compared to dihydrotestosterone, DHT, S4 restored levator anti and soleus muscle mass post-castration, and skeletal muscle strength was also restored to intact levels. Male Sprague Dawley rats were castrated and left alone for 12 weeks to allow maximum decrease in soleus muscle mass and strength to occur. They were then treated with either 3 milligrams per kilogram of S4, 10 milligrams per kilogram of S4, 3 milligrams per kilogram of DHT, or nothing for 8 weeks. The nothing is the vehicle. S4 selectively restored the tissue weight loss that occurred after castration. As you can see in the chart, S4 exhibited a dose-dependent increase in androgenic activity. However, the ratio of its anabolic activity relative to its androgenic activity is far more favorable than DHT. It's not absent of prostate stimulation, but it has a far better efficacy profile than DHT does, which just so happens to be one of the two main hormones humans endogenously rely on for androgen-mediated functions. At a dose of 3 milligrams per kilogram per day, S4 restored prostate weight to less than 20% of the intact level. The intact level is the weight of the rat prostate based on stimulation from their own endogenous natural hormone production, which is testosterone and DHT. The 3 milligram per kilogram per day dose of S4 fully restored the levator anti-muscle to control level. This means that the dosage required to replicate the anabolic related therapeutic benefits fulfilled by testosterone and DHT that the body endogenously produces can be accomplished by a dose of S4 that only stimulates prostate growth enough to sustain 20% of its natural level. While it isn't totally absent of androgenic activity, the fact that prostate weight can drop by minus 80% and 100% of muscle mass can be maintained at that dosage exhibits just how much potential the SARM has for potential applications in treating muscle and bone wasting diseases in men and women, reversing prostate hypertrophy, and HRT. Strength levels were also restored to that of intact levels as well. Tissue selectivity of S4 in intact rat studies. So this was the first study that assessed the pharmacological effects of S4 in intact rats. Both S1 and S4 demonstrated partial agonist activity in the androgenic tissues, prostate, and full agonist activity in muscle, the levator ani muscle, in both castrated and intact rats. However, in castrated rats, prostate weight dropped down far lower than in the intact rat group. This implies that S4 may actually be more androgenic than implied by the castration models. Prostate weight only dropped about 20% in intact rats, and while the levator ani muscle in this group actually went to slightly supraphysiological levels, the ideal candidate would drop prostate size to castration vehicle levels while maintaining 100% therapeutic anabolism. Perhaps the study length isn't long enough to make an accurate assessment, as castration causes prostate weight to plummet, and S4 administration at therapeutic levels doesn't increase the weight above 40% of the intact vehicle control while simultaneously restoring anabolic activity to 100%, but S4 in intact rats only decreases prostate size by about 20%. If S4 were to be used in a therapeutic context, patients would obviously not be castrated prior to using it, so the intact rat model sheds a bit more light on what is realistic to expect from this compound at a low dosage. Perhaps if it was used for a longer duration of time, prostate size would have continued to drop, although that would need to be determined by further testing. Personally, I would be interested to see if there was a middle ground where the castrated group and intact group on S4 would eventually meet, equal out, and plateau in regards to androgenic activity. Another more likely possibility is that the dosage of S4 used was just not high enough to yield as much of a prostate weight decrease as would be ideal. As the dosage of S4 increases, further suppression of testosterone and consequently DHT would occur, thereby reducing prostate size more and more until a middle ground is reached between endogenous androgen suppression, induced prostate weight decrease, and andarine's inherent prostate stimulation effects, as well as androgen receptor competition via the binding affinity of the SARM inherently, which is more likely representative in the castrated rat models. Reduces prostate size. So androgen suppression with 5-alpha reductase inhibitors and antiandrogens are two of the main treatments for benign prostate hyperplasia based on S4's partial agonist activity in the prostate relative to full agonistic activity in lean muscle tissue. Investigating whether it could be used as an alternative treatment for benign prostate hyperplasia was desirable. S1 is another SARM that was assessed in this study as well. 0.5 milligrams per day of S1 or S4 were given to the treated rats and compared to castrated and intact rats who received either nothing or 0.5 milligrams per day of testosterone propionate, while S1 and S4 showed similar selectivity milligram for milligram. S4 was a more potent agonist of muscle and less suppressive than S1. While this is desirable for certain treatment options like HRT, when it comes to treating benign prostate hyperplasia, the goal is suppressing endogenous androgens as much as possible, and S1's potency in prostate weight suppression via endogenous androgen suppression was more potent, while S4 could have resulted in the same level of endocrine suppression at higher dosages and higher anabolic activity as well. In this model, where lowering prostate weight with as low of a dosage of a drug as possible is the goal, S1 had a greater efficacy profile. To clarify, in terms of overall anabolic efficacy, S4 is a better alternative to S1 in terms of potency, just not in a therapeutic context of lowering prostate size, where a more suppressive SARM would yield better results closer to castration vehicles. S4 was not compared to hydroxyflutamide or finasteride in this study, as it exhibited a lower efficacy profile than S1 in regards to endogenous androgen suppression and decreasing prostate weight. In this animal model, S1 was just as effective at lowering prostate weight as hydroxyflutamide and finasteride, while being more effective than both at maintaining muscle mass. And this is essentially where I started to theorize about how low-dose SARMs could potentially be used as a therapeutic alternative to anti-androgen therapy in a hair loss prevention context. But that's another video for another time. I've actually delved into this in separate videos anyways that you can check out. In the finasteride treated group, muscle mass slightly increased, which was likely due to the 15% boost in testosterone finasteride causes when endogenous DHT production is inhibited via 5-alpha reductase inhibition. Hydroxyflutamide caused a loss of muscle in a dose-dependent manner, which is to be expected when endogenous androgens are unable to bind to androgen receptors and exert their effects in the body. S1 caused a dose-dependent increase in muscle mass, with muscle mass exceeding that of the control group at each dosage. And this is important to note because this is an example of the efficacy of SARMs when it comes to preventing prostate issues induced by natural endogenous androgen production, while simultaneously inducing more anabolic activity than those same levels of endogenous androgens are capable of providing. Increases bone mineral density. So testosterone's ability to maintain bone mineral density is mediated through the androgen receptor, but is not potentiated via 5-alpha reductase and its conversion of testosterone to DHT. And the inhibition of 5-alpha reductase did not hinder anabolism in bone in rats or humans, meaning that DHT is unnecessary for facilitating bone mineral retention and overall bone strength. While testosterone isn't a selective androgen by any means, it exhibits a far more favorable anabolic to androgenic selectivity than DHT. We can assert that testosterone's ability to maintain optimal anabolic effects in bone on its own, irrespective of DHT, exemplifies how using an even more selective anabolic agent to fulfill the same function with a lower level of androgenicity could very well lead to the same outcomes in bone with a greater safety profile. Hence why SARMs are being looked at as a potential treatment option for bone wasting diseases like osteoporosis. S4's ability to maintain and increase bone mineral density was evaluated in several preclinical animal models. Each animal study determined that S4 induces anabolic effects in bone, prevents bone loss, and increases overall bone mineral density. They also exhibited a greater level of efficacy of bone retention than DHT. May enhance fat loss. In a study conducted on ovary-ectomized female rats, S4 treatment maintained whole body and trabecular bone mineral density, cortical content, and increased bone strength while lowering body fat. Body fat content can be influenced by a variety of things irrespective of S4 administration, and there is data to support that Andarine has no effect on enhancing fat loss. Personally, I believe the positive effect anabolic agents have on body fat is an indirect result of increased muscle mass, which then increases metabolism and results in more fat being burned at rest and an increase in total daily energy expenditure. Therefore, S4, if anything, likely increases basal metabolic rate indirectly via its ability to build superphysiological amounts of lean muscle mass, but doesn't inherently accelerate lipolysis. S4 results in anecdotal and recreational use. So the most commonly reported S4 results among recreational users are significant muscle and strength increases and an increase in muscular detail, dryness, and vascularity, as well as an improvement overall in body composition. Muscle hardness and lean, dry muscle gain are the major appeals of S4 for recreational users. One thing that is important to note, though, is that all SARMs do not work the same despite exerting anabolic activity in the same manner. So each SARM has a different way it affects the body, as they each have their own anabolic transcription effects, so to say, as well as individual specific potency, level of tissue selectivity, binding affinity, etc. Results from a SARM like S4 will very likely differ from that of Ostrine or LGD4033. Milligram for milligram, S4 is not as potent of a lean mass builder as LGD-4033, but it is still an effective muscle building agent nonetheless, as proven via the preclinical data and a myriad of anecdotal reports. And that's while being less suppressive than LGD simultaneously. So comparing S4 to S23, the first thing we can establish is that S23 is far more suppressive than S4. It is more potent of an anabolic agent, milligram for milligram. However, even low dosages will suppress endogenous androgens much closer to castration levels than S4 will. While this is favorable for certain therapeutic applications, it makes S23 a poor option for many users and many other therapeutic applications where that outcome would be undesirable. So for those on HRT, for example, this can make S23 a potentially more attractive alternative, as it can induce more anabolic activity at lower dosages. And this is why S23 is commonly used recreationally alongside exogenous testosterone as a base, due to, the inherent aromatization of testosterone to estrogen to fulfill that pathway that would otherwise be left completely unmet or completely unfulfilled via, if you have a completely shut down endocrine system and you're on SARMs only, there's no source of estrogen in the body, which leads to a variety of deleterious outcomes. So this is also why S23 is in development right now as a potential male contraceptive, due to its high level of endocrine suppression. And while the data is extremely limited for both SARMs, there is much less preclinical data on S23, even anecdotally. The inherent androgenicity of S23 is blatantly far greater milligram for milligram than S4, and for the majority of therapeutic applications would disqualify it entirely as a ideal novel SARM for anabolic, like the entire point of the conception of SARMs for the treatment of 99% of things. So the only thing S23 really excels at is being a male contraceptive and potentially providing a libido boost in the state of androgen deficiency for those who, perhaps an alternative to Proviron or something like that. That's what is being looked at right now. But in an anabolic to androgenic context of what's more selective, it's actually probably the S4, even though it was abandoned, which is interesting. Looking at S4 versus Osterine, it's much easier to make a more accurate assessment between these two than S4 versus S23. Both SARMs were developed by GTx, but S4 was abandoned even after a significant amount of extremely promising preclinical data, and we can only assume that the reason for this was because Osterine was determined to have a greater efficacy and safety profile than S4. That doesn't mean that in certain contexts S4 wouldn't be a more ideal candidate, and this is more likely just with recreational users who prefer it or respond better to it, but in general, Osterine appears to be a more ideal SARM candidate for therapeutic applications. But frankly, in terms of blood work, health markers, and overall efficacy I've seen in a recreational context, S4, aside from the blatant downside of vision impairment, it seems to be more efficacious than Osterine, in my opinion. Perhaps not milligram for milligram in terms of anabolism, but in terms of overall anabolic to androgenic activity and lack of hindering health markers on paper. It's hard to explain, but other than the vision side effect, S4 actually looks really, really good in my opinion. In development, it's also very possible that the eyesight side effect was discovered in humans and resulted in the project's abandonment, similar to the Andarine cancer data that was seemingly suppressed for a couple of years before it was publicly presented. But obviously that is just, just guessing if you were to, try and figure out why it was abandoned. Comparing S4 to anabolic androgenic steroids. So when it comes to anabolic androgenic activity, the ratio of it, S4 outperforms every single known anabolic androgenic steroid in terms of just its tissue selectivity. However, this has its limitations, as there seems to be a lower threshold of diminishing returns with S4 and SARMs in general than there is with anabolic androgenic steroids. And when it comes to SARMs and steroids, SARMs are extremely selective at certain dosages, but there is a ceiling where increasing the dosage only increases the potential for side effects in the body with a greatly diminishing level of muscle growth potential. At least orally, we have yet to see these efficacy measures in injectable format. Muscle to prostate anabolic to androgenic ratio of tissue selectivity is far less favorable with steroids, particularly with DHT. But there is a higher ceiling of diminishing returns when it comes to anabolic activity potential with many steroids relative to SARMs, at least right now. Essentially, SARMs appear to be more favorable in a tissue selectivity context when it comes to therapeutic application, at least orally, but in a bodybuilding context, building a significant amount of muscle beyond the genetic potential of an individual, largely determined by endogenous androgen production, is limited, and megadosing SARMs appears to build minimal muscle beyond the ceiling and just stimulates greater androgenic activity. And again, that's at least orally and from what I've seen anecdotally. So whereas with steroids, while the ratio is far less favorable in a tissue selectivity context when it comes to therapeutic applications, in a bodybuilding context, the ceiling for diminished returns in regards to anabolic activity seems to be higher with certain steroids. So if you look at the anabolic to androgenic activity of S4 versus testosterone, despite the high levels of androgenic activity of steroids at this level of diminishing returns for anabolic activity, the fact remains that the ceiling for anabolism when it comes to steroids is higher. Therefore, in a therapeutic context, SARMs will likely become regarded as the better alternative for inducing anabolism with minimal androgenic activity. But in a superphysiological bodybuilding context, SARMs will not be building the physiques of any Mr. Olympia competitors anytime soon, at least with the current format that they're being presented and administered. And that's also not until potentially more selective SARMs with higher ceilings of diminishing returns are developed, and perhaps higher binding affinities and, better, selectivity and ability to transcribe their anabolic effects in specific tissues. It's kind of like, it's a matter of time, in my opinion. In layman's terms, building a massive IFBB Pro open bodybuilder caliber ripped physique is impossible with the current SARMs in development. Orally, I have no idea about injectable, that remains to be seen. But achieving a muscular and slightly superphysiological physique with only SARMs with a simultaneous reduction of androgenic side effects in the body, which is what the majority of the population would prefer, seems to be realistic if one were to evaluate efficacy relative to recreational standards. Comparing S4 to Winstrol, milligram for milligram, S4 exhibits similar levels of muscle building potential to Winstrol, but with far less endocrine suppression and androgenic activity in the body. Winstrol is very androgenic. It is a DHT derivative and will suppress natural testosterone levels by as much as 55% within just 2 weeks of using 10 milligrams per day. Most bodybuilders use no less than 30 milligrams of Winstrol per day, and dosages of 50 to 100 milligrams per day are far more common in a recreational capacity. Consequently, S4 typically results in similar levels of muscle growth with less androgenic side effects, including natural testosterone suppression. Winstrol has a bit of a more drying out cosmetic effect that is favorable for bodybuilders stepping on stage. While this makes S4 sound like a better compound, it needs to be noted that at formidable dosages where both compounds exhibit significant muscle building potential, S4 typically results in significant night vision complications. So both compounds have severe limitations that's not even factoring in Winstrol's destructive effects on lipid profiles, as well as hepatotoxicity. S4 versus DHT. So in all preclinical animal models that compared equal dosages of S4 and DHT, S4 consistently outperformed DHT in all efficacy measures. DHT in general is a very poor anabolic agent and excels only in stimulating androgenic activity in androgen-sensitive tissues like the prostate gland and hair follicles. Half-life. The half-life of S4 is 4 hours in humans, reportedly. The data assessing the pharmacokinetics of S4 in humans was never officially published, but it is referenced a few times, thus we can assume that there was a trial conducted on humans at some point. With that being said, from personal experience, twice per day dosing seems to have a accumulation effect in terms of just based on the vision side effect that I experienced, and I'm not so sure that the half-life is actually 4 hours when orally administered, but that's what the data says. So Side effects, vision impairment. Vision impairment in dark settings is the most notorious S4 side effect, while this was not reported in any of the preclinical data, likely because no human data was ever published, and we can only reference preclinical animal models. Andarine exhibits a very unique and strange side effect at high enough dosages. 50 milligrams per day or higher seems to be the standard dose where the side effects kick in for most individuals. And S4 can cause a temporary yellow tint to be noticed in sight and significant issues adjusting from dark to light settings. I'm not really sure. I guess yellow tint can be a good description. I find it's more so almost like you're colorblind to some extent, and things, it's almost like a green tint. Some people report yellow. I think it's more like almost like a yellowish green film of like sepia filters put over your eyes. It's kind of weird, but that's the best way I can describe it. It's most obvious when you go from like, if you're driving your car and you go into like an underground parking lot, that's where you're really going to notice it. Or if you're like sitting on your porch or something and you're trying to look up at the stars in the dark, you used to be able to see stars. You're not going to see anything on a high dose of S4, I'll tell you that. Or not even the drink like 2 feet in front of your hand, to be honest. So dark settings, that's what really makes it obvious where the side effects are kicking in. So most notable is during nighttime. There are no anecdotal reports of this being permanent, and vision seems to return to normal shortly after discontinuation. The length of time it takes for the vision side effect to resolve also kind of, contributes to my theory that perhaps the half-life is longer than 4 hours, because if people are doing twice per day dosing and it's taking a week plus to resolve the vision side effect, it doesn't seem to add up in terms of the half-life. But anyways, my theory is a bit different than what most people think on how S4, the mechanism of action in terms of the vision side effects. So the theory that most have is that Andarine binds to the ocular receptors in the eyes and causes this night vision issue. So my theory, it's a bit different. It's sort of the same, but it's different. So let me elaborate. SARMs bind tightly to androgen receptors, as that is what they were designed to do in a selective manner. And there are androgen receptors in cells of the cornea, lens, iris, and ciliary body of the eye, at least in mice. I propose that S4 likely binds to the androgen receptors in these parts of the eye, as it is designed to, and affects other cells in these tissues directly through its interaction with the androgen receptor specifically. And this is done in a unique way that impairs vision adjustment rather than competing and binding to the ocular receptors that are otherwise responsible for dark to light vision adjustment. So I believe this side effect specifically may have actually led to the abandonment of S4 in preclinical trials. Decreased good cholesterol. HDL wasn't a health marker evaluated in any of the preclinical animal models conducted using S4. However, bioidentical androgens always exhibit a dose-dependent suppression of HDL cholesterol, and this is demonstrated in clinical trials conducted using SARMs as well, just to a lesser extent. The clinical data shows dose-dependent suppression of HDL cholesterol and triglyceride levels with LGD 4033 usage, as well as with other SARMs that have been evaluated at therapeutic dosages in humans. Andarine is no different and will also suppress HDL in a dose-dependent manner. This suppression is far less extreme than that of traditional anabolic steroids, but it exists nonetheless. And I assert this based on personal blood work, countless anecdotal logs, not based on official trial data, which should be noted. However, if an official trial was to be conducted on S4, I believe that HDL suppression would be noted. A negative effect on HDL levels is consistently noted as a common side effect of all traditional steroids and other SARMs. With that being said, S4 doesn't exhibit as much HDL suppression as some other SARMs, at least anecdotally. Based on anecdotal blood work, Andarine seems to have a more detrimental impact on lipids than S4, but that comes at a trade-off for other side effects like night vision impairment. Of all the mainstream SARMs, S4 is one of the most forgiving on HDL levels from what I have seen in blood work. Testosterone suppression. So SARMs have consistently demonstrated suppression of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone through the HPTA, thus decreasing testosterone in a dose-dependent manner. S4 is one of the least suppressive SARMs and still retains a promising efficacy profile despite this. While S4 isn't as suppressive as some of the more potent SARMs like S23 or LGD4033, it will still cause endocrine suppression in a dose-dependent manner. Luteinizing hormone levels in castrated rats treated with testosterone propionate and GTx-014, another abandoned SARM, were significantly lower than those of castrated, untreated rats, the control for the study, at doses greater than or equal to 0.3 milligrams per day. S4, also known as GTx-007, did not cause significant decreases in luteinizing hormone levels until a dosage of 0.5 milligrams per day or higher was administered. Therefore, S4 exhibited the ability to elicit maximal stimulation of muscle growth at a dosage that does not suppress LH levels. In another preclinical animal model comparing S4 to DHT, S4 did not suppress LH levels or FSH levels at doses that were capable of eliciting maximal stimulation of muscle growth. The way you can interpret these charts is by looking at where the LH and FSH levels are in the intact control rats first and using that as your reference point. So as you can see, intact rats, untreated and non-castrated rats have LH levels roughly equivalent to 5 nanograms per milliliter and FSH levels approximately equal to 20 nanograms per milliliter. Once a rat is castrated, their LH and FSH levels dramatically spike up as a way to signal to the body to produce more endogenous androgens as their systemic levels plummet as a result of castration. It's the body's feedback loop that occurs when androgen levels are too low in the body and it's trying to signal to start producing testosterone. Obviously, because the rats are castrated, they aren't able to naturally produce testosterone like intact rats, so LH and FSH levels go sky high and remain there. The only way to drop those levels would be to endogenously produce a sufficient amount of androgens to fulfill physiological functions, or to administer an exogenous source that can fulfill those same functions and mitigate the need to produce testosterone in the first place. Exogenous DHT treatment handily drops FSH and LH levels back to baseline as it is so androgenic. S4, on the other hand, was able to restore all muscle loss that occurred after castration, thus fulfilling the critical need for endogenous androgens when it comes to muscle and bone retention, while simultaneously maintaining LH and FSH levels higher than intact rats that weren't castrated. The agonist activity of S4 in the pituitary is measured by evaluating the plasma concentrations of LH and FSH. It took a dosage of S4 over 3 times higher than DHT to restore LH levels to intact levels, but this dosage was still not even high enough to return FSH levels to the intact control level. The preclinical data suggests that S4 is a very selective SARM and only exhibits a mild amount of suppression at what would be considered therapeutic dosages. Increased estrogen or decreased estrogen. S4 does not aromatize into estrogen, but it can still cause a systemic increase or decrease in estrogen levels. So S4 suppresses natural testosterone levels, which can result in an unfavorable balance between testosterone and estrogen levels in the body. In addition, S4 has a high binding affinity at the androgen receptor, meaning it is possible that it could divert testosterone to aromatize that wouldn't have otherwise, consequently increasing estrogen levels. The systemic elevation of estrogen levels in the body is commonly misinterpreted as the result of pro-hormone laced SARMs. I'm not going to get into all the high estrogen side effects. I've mentioned these in pretty much all the other videos, but high dosages and or long-term use of S4 can also cause a decrease in systemic estrogen levels via higher levels of endocrine suppression. Estrogen facilitated physiological functions in the body are mediated through the aromatization of testosterone into a sufficient amount of estrogen. If S4 usage suppresses endogenous testosterone levels too low, it can result in estrogen levels dropping as a consequence of the sheer lack of aromatization occurring in the body in a suppressed state. So when estrogen levels get too low, an entirely new set of deleterious side effects can occur, all of which I've covered in previous videos covering the other SARMs, which I'm not going to delve into again in this one. Androgenic activity. S4 did not exhibit androgenic activity in preclinical rat models equivalent to that of intact rat controls, non-castrated, untreated rats with normal endogenous androgen production, even when used in very high dosages. The dosage of S4 that would be required to yield the same amount of androgenic activity in the body that endogenous androgens do would be higher than the therapeutic dosage required. While S4 will increase androgen activity in the body in a dose-dependent manner, the selectivity of its anabolic to androgenic activity is favorable enough that the therapeutic dosage to reach sufficient anabolic activity in muscle and bone would lower systemic androgenic activity. On the other side of the spectrum, if mega doses of S4 were used daily, it would likely eventually exceed baseline androgenic activity in the body, but this is likely irrelevant for the context in which this compound would hypothetically be used as a treatment anyways in a clinical setting. In a performance enhancement context, though, very high dosages may result in some notable androgenic side effects in the body, while more moderate dosages may reduce androgenic side effects in the body. Hair loss. All androgens cause androgenic alopecia in a dose-dependent manner, but the extent to which they do this is dependent on their tissue selectivity, binding affinity, and the dosage used. In general, S4 should not cause any male pattern baldness progression, and it may in fact support its reversal to some extent as a result of endogenous androgen suppression and androgen receptor site competition. This does not exclude temporary shedding, though, acute telogen effluvium, which can be triggered by any hormonal fluctuation. Hormonal shifts can cause roots to be pushed into the resting state prematurely, and the result of that can be a temporary shedding phase. So temporary shedding phases are commonly caused by hormonal fluctuations, stressors, autoimmune responses, nutrient deficiencies, or chemical imbalances. So this is not androgenic alopecia, which is caused by follicular miniaturization induced by androgens. Based on the efficacy data comparing S1 to finasteride, it is likely that S4, if anything, would reduce the progression of hair loss at therapeutic dosages based on its similar tissue selectivity. Liver toxicity. AST and ALT levels weren't evaluated in any of the S4 preclinical animal models, so we can only extrapolate data from other clinical trials with similar SARMs. In an Austrian trial conducted on humans, which is a very similar SARM to S4 developed by the same company, short-lived increases in ALT to above the upper limit of normal were observed in 8 subjects. Considering this, it's possible that S4 could also elevate ALT levels to and exhibit some degree of liver toxicity. And anecdotally, mega doses of SARMs, or doses far higher than the therapeutic level, show blatant increases in liver enzymes constantly. And this is, irrespective of pro-hormone-laced SARMs. This is another common misconception that SARMs are not liver toxic or have no ability to increase liver enzymes, and that's just not the case. And that's even proven at clinical dosages in human trials, not rat models, but human trials, as well as a myriad of anecdotal blood work that you can find online of people who've experienced increases in ALT and AST as a result of high doses of SARMs. Potential hormone replacement therapy applications in men. So S4 doesn't aromatize into estrogen, therefore it would lack the efficacy profile testosterone has when it comes to complete hormone replacement therapy as a form of monotherapy. Estrogen is a vital hormone, not only in women, but in men as well, just in lower amounts. If S4 in a hypothetical hormone replacement therapy context was not used concurrently with exogenous estrogen in hypogonadal men, low estrogen side effects would start to occur. It is not a viable standalone treatment for hormone replacement therapy, and while high levels of estrogen can cause a variety of health complications, low estrogen levels can be just as deleterious. So anyways, that is my comprehensive overview of S4. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Please like, subscribe, drop a comment. Helps the algorithm when you guys like and comment on the videos. Check me out on Instagram. Follow me there at moreplates_more_dates. Snapchat, Twitter, Facebook. Subscribe to the newsletter on moreplatesmoredates.com if you haven't already. That's where you can get notified every time a new article is published and have it sent right to your inbox. Hit the notification bell if I'm not already. Apparently you don't show up in the sub box if you don't do that. And check out the podcast, link in the video description below, and drop a 5-star rating if you can. That's always much appreciated too. Helps the algorithm there, and it's really appreciated. So thank you guys for watching. Talk to you soon.